The morning sun spilled over the glass and steel facade of Ridgewood High, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawns and sleek black SUVs parked along the driveway. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a private school in Seattle, where the air smelled faintly of polished wood, cafeteria food, and the faint perfume of wealth. Every corner reflected status, expensive backpacks, designer sneakers, and crisp uniforms pressed to perfection. Among the students navigating the busy corridors, Brandon Whitmore stood out. At 17, he had grown accustomed to the privileges that came with being the only son of Richard Whitmore, the tech magnate who had founded Whitmore Systems, a company valued in the billions. Brandon's silver hair-streaked backpack swung casually over one shoulder as he walked with a confidence that demanded attention, his friends trailing behind, laughing at some shared joke. Brandon's life, by all outward appearances, was effortless. He had the latest gadgets before anyone else, the best grades he didn't always earn, and a charm that made teachers overlook his arrogance. He could command a room with a smile or dismiss it with a wave of his hand. To him, Ridgewood High was a playground designed to affirm his superiority, a place where he could strut without consequence. But arrogance, Brandon had learned early, came easily when surrounded by wealth and indulgence. He teased classmates, mocked small mistakes, and reveled in their discomfort. The janitors, cafeteria staff, and maintenance workers, people who kept the school running, were invisible to him most of the time. They existed only as background props to his drama-filled adolescent life. And then there was Ellis Turner. Brandon noticed him sometimes, though he rarely paid much attention. A quiet man in his late 50s, Ellis had a presence that went unnoticed unless you really looked. His gray uniform, a little faded at the sleeves, hinted at years of service. His boots were scuffed, and his hands bore the calluses of hard, honest work. He moved through the halls with a rhythm that suggested discipline, not laziness, a careful choreography of cleaning, repairing, and tidying that Brandon had never considered necessary. Most students ignored Ellis, stepping around him like he was part of the floor tiles themselves. Brandon, however, occasionally found amusement in watching the older man work. He whispered jokes to his friends, laughing at Ellis's slow, methodical ways. He didn't see him as a person, just another character in the theater of his privileged life. On this particular Monday, Brandon lounged near his locker, flipping through a comic on his tablet while sipping a mocha from the school cafe. His friends gathered around, sharing stories from the weekend, and Brandon laughed easily, his attention divided between his friends and the janitor scrubbing the hallway floors a few steps away. "Hey, careful down there, old man," Brandon called out with a grin, making exaggerated gestures as if Ellis were performing a circus act. "You missed a spot. Maybe your eyesight's as outdated as that mop of yours." The laughter from his friends echoed in the hall, a chorus of mockery that made Ellis look up briefly. He met Brandon's gaze with a small, patient smile. There was no anger in his eyes, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned that patience was stronger than outrage. "Just doing my job, son," Ellis said softly. "The floor doesn't clean itself." Brandon rolled his eyes, shrugging dismissively as he returned to his comic. "Man, I could never do what he does," he muttered to his friends. "Couldn't be me." Ellis continued his work, undeterred, but in the quiet of his own thoughts, he whispered something Brandon didn't hear. "Maybe that's the problem." And though Brandon didn't notice it, a subtle tension began to build. There was something about Ellis's composure, his quiet dignity, that planted a tiny seed of curiosity in Brandon's mind, an instinct he would not recognize until later, when that seed would grow into a storm of realization that would change him forever. As the morning bell rang, Brandon slung his backpack over his shoulder and joined his friends, leaving Ellis kneeling on the floor, scrubbing away. To everyone else, it was a mundane scene, the janitor at work, the rich kid on display. But for the story that was about to unfold, it was the first line of a chapter that neither Brandon nor anyone else could have anticipated. Because in the heart of Ridgewood High, behind gray tiles and fading paint, lay a secret waiting to be discovered, a hidden story that would challenge every assumption Brandon had about success, worth, and humanity. Little did he know, his journey from mockery to awe was about to begin. Ridgewood High hummed with the usual morning chaos. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked against polished floors, and the chatter of students filled every corridor. Yet, amidst this commotion, Ellis Turner moved with a quiet rhythm, almost invisible to everyone around him. Ellis had been at Ridgewood for 8 years, and during that time, he had developed an almost intimate knowledge of the school's corners, hallways, and hidden spaces. Every floor tile, every squeaky locker hinge, every flickering light bulb, he knew them all. Students rarely noticed, teachers barely glanced up, and administration treated him as a functional necessity rather than a person. Yet, for all the invisibility he endured, Ellis carried himself with dignity. His movements were deliberate. There was a patience in the way he scrubbed the floors, straightened the chairs, or repaired the lockers. It was the kind of patience that comes from having seen life unravel in ways most people never imagine. To anyone else, Ellis seemed like a simple janitor, quietly keeping the school clean. But there was more, much more, than met the eye. Beneath the uniform and work-worn boots was a man who had once thrived in arenas far removed from the linoleum floors and metal lockers of Ridgewood High. He had once designed machines that soared into the sky, contributed to innovations in engineering, and dreamed in equations that could power satellites. Yet, life had taken a cruel turn. Loss had reshaped him, and Ridgewood had become his refuge. He had chosen humility over recognition, quiet service over accolades, a simple life over ambition. Most students couldn't begin to imagine the depth of the man kneeling before them with a mop in hand. Brandon Whitmore, of course, saw none of this. To him, Ellis was a joke, a target for his casual mockery. One morning, as Brandon leaned against his locker, tossing a pen in the air and catching it with a grin, he couldn't resist. "Hey, Ellis! Make sure you don't miss a spot today, or my dad might demote you to." "I don't know, cafeteria duty," he called, laughter echoing down the corridor. His friends joined in, their chuckles amplifying the humiliation. Ellis looked up slowly, the mop stilling mid-motion. For a moment, the hallway seemed to pause. There was no anger, no reaction that Brandon could understand, only a calm, measured patience. "Careful, Brandon," Ellis said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "The floor doesn't mind how many times it's cleaned. People do." The words slipped past Brandon's comprehension. He blinked, shrugged, and turned back to his friends, laughing off the interaction. But Ellis's voice lingered in the air, subtle and almost haunting, a reminder that beneath every man, there could be untold stories and quiet strength. Ellis returned to his work, but inside, a silent tension hummed. There was something about Brandon's laughter that irked him, not because of the words, but because it reflected a perspective he had once shared in his youth. Ambition had once blinded him too, but life had taught him the value of humility and the danger of judging by appearances alone. While Brandon moved through the halls with all the confidence of inherited wealth, Ellis moved with the weight of experience. He had learned that respect is earned quietly, not demanded, and that the richest treasures in life were often invisible to the eye. And then there was the locker. Locker 112, tucked into a rarely used hallway near the maintenance area, was Ellis's small sanctuary. It was nondescript, rusty at the hinges, with layers of stickers peeling from years of neglect. Most students ignored it entirely. Brandon, however, had begun to notice it in fleeting glimpses, a glimpse of papers, a corner of a photograph, a folder that seemed too thick for a janitor's needs. Curiosity stirred in Brandon, though he didn't fully understand why. His mind catalogued the oddity with the same casual arrogance he applied to everything else, filing it away as something to joke about later. Yet, deep down, there was an uneasy spark, a subtle awareness that this man, this invisible, unassuming janitor, was hiding something. Over the next few days, Brandon's attention to Ellis grew. He noticed the meticulous way Ellis folded his cleaning rags, the careful labeling of supplies, and the way his eyes lingered on certain students who seemed lost or troubled. There was empathy there, quiet and unobtrusive, a stark contrast to Brandon's loud, performative confidence. Ellis never sought recognition. He smiled at students who thanked him, nodded at teachers, and carried on with his work. But there was a rhythm to him that suggested a life rich with experiences, victories, and perhaps regrets. A life that Brandon would soon learn was far more extraordinary than anything he had ever imagined. One afternoon, Brandon lingered longer than usual near the maintenance area, pretending to check his locker but subtly observing Ellis. He noticed the janitor open his locker, carefully retrieve a folder, glance at its contents, and then tuck it back. Brandon's curiosity intensified. The folder seemed important. Not mundane. Not something that belonged to someone he assumed was just a janitor. Brandon's friends noticed his distracted state. "You okay, man?" one of them asked. "You've been staring at the old guy's locker for like 5 minutes." Brandon laughed nervously. Yeah, just thinking. You know, random stuff." But he wasn't thinking about random stuff. His mind raced with questions. Why would a janitor need a folder that looked so official? Who was he before this? What kind of life had he left behind? And more unsettlingly, why did a part of Brandon feel small, almost inadequate, when he looked at Ellis quietly handling his day-to-day responsibilities? Ellis Turner moved through Ridgewood High like a shadow with substance, invisible yet integral, silent yet full of lessons. Brandon Whitmore, in all his wealth and privilege, had never paused to reflect on what real strength, resilience, and purpose looked like. That was about to change. Because behind the mop, the faded uniform, and the routine cleaning was a story that would shatter Brandon's assumptions, challenge his arrogance, and ultimately teach him a lesson he would never forget. And all of it began with a janitor who nobody noticed, but whose life was far more extraordinary than anyone at Ridgewood High could imagine. The morning air in Ridgewood High carried a chill that bit gently at the students' faces as they hurried through the marble halls toward their first classes. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked against polished floors, and laughter echoed like a soundtrack of privilege. Yet amid the noise and movement, one figure moved silently and deliberately, Ellis Turner, the janitor. Ellis had become a fixture of the school, a quiet constant in a world that revolved around wealth, influence, and teenage popularity. He had grown accustomed to being invisible. Students rarely acknowledged his presence, teachers only nodded politely, and administrators regarded him as nothing more than someone who kept the school functioning. But for Brandon Whitmore, Ellis was an easy target, a canvas for ridicule, a source of fleeting amusement. Brandon had grown comfortable with the power his wealth and status afforded him, and in that comfort, he had become careless. It happened one Tuesday morning, just as Brandon and his friends were gathering near the lockers. The janitor was on his hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the hallway tiles. Brandon leaned lazily against his locker, sipping a cappuccino he bought with his father's credit card, and waited for the perfect opportunity. "Hey, Ellis!" Brandon called out with exaggerated cheer. "Don't work too hard. Wouldn't want the Janitor of the Year award to go to someone else." His friends erupted in laughter, their mockery echoing through the hallway. Brandon's grin widened as he made a dramatic gesture toward the floor. "Careful, careful, there. Missed a spot again. That's gonna cost you." Ellis paused, a mop in his hand, and looked up at Brandon. There was no anger, no humiliation, only a calm that seemed to hold centuries of quiet wisdom. He straightened slowly and spoke, his voice measured but carrying a subtle weight that made Brandon feel an odd flicker of unease. "Son, the floor doesn't mind how often it's cleaned." "People do," Ellis said. The word struck Brandon oddly, though he didn't understand why. He laughed and shrugged, trying to dismiss the sudden pang of discomfort. His friends laughed with him, oblivious to the subtle tension settling in the hall. Ellis resumed his work, but Brandon's attention had shifted. There was something about the calm in Ellis's demeanor that pricked at him, a small, uncomfortable awareness that this man, whom he had always dismissed, held a quiet authority that Brandon could not name. As the day wore on, Brandon found himself stealing glances at Ellis more often than usual. He noticed the precision in the way Ellis handled his tools, the careful organization of his cleaning supplies, and the faint, almost imperceptible nods Ellis gave to students struggling with heavy backpacks or hurried steps. There was a grace to Ellis's routine, a dignity that Brandon had never associated with a janitor before. Yet Brandon's ego refused to yield. That afternoon, during a brief break between classes, he gathered his friends near the cafeteria and whispered, "You ever notice how the janitor acts like he's some kind of secret genius? Watch this." With exaggerated gestures, Brandon approached Ellis, crouched slightly, and squinted at him like a curious detective. "Hey, Ellis, found anything interesting in that locker today? Or just more dust and mop water?" Laughter erupted again. Ellis didn't flinch. Instead, he looked Brandon directly in the eye and smiled faintly, almost knowingly. It was a smile that suggested patience, but also understanding. Brandon felt a strange unease, as though he were being seen more clearly than he had ever been seen before. Over the next few weeks, this pattern continued. Brandon's teasing escalated, and Ellis remained unshaken. Students whispered to one another, noting how the janitor seemed immune to ridicule, how he continued his work with quiet diligence. The contrast between Brandon's arrogance and Ellis's calm presence created a tension that was palpable, even to those who didn't know the full story. Late one afternoon, Brandon lingered near the maintenance hallway, ostensibly waiting for a friend. But his eyes kept darting toward locker 112, Ellis's personal space, where he had once glimpsed the corner of a folder protruding. Curiosity tugged at him, stronger with each passing day, yet he masked it with jokes and laughter. "Do you think he's hiding treasure in there?" Brandon whispered to his friend. "Maybe secret awards or money? Or old blueprints for some crazy invention?" His friend snorted, shaking his head. "Man, it's a janitor's locker. Chill. You're reading too much into it." Brandon shrugged but didn't look away. There was something compelling in the way Ellis carried himself, something beyond the uniform and the mop. Brandon didn't know it yet, but he was on the edge of a discovery that would upend everything he thought he knew about value, success, and the people around him. Tension began to build in Brandon's mind, a strange mix of curiosity and unease. He noticed the way students instinctively respected Ellis without knowing why, the quiet nods of teachers, and the subtle deference the staff gave him. Every observation contradicted Brandon's assumptions about the janitor, stirring a restlessness he could not articulate. One rainy afternoon, as Brandon passed by the maintenance area, he saw Ellis quietly adjusting his uniform, retrieving a folder, and glancing at its contents before slipping it back inside the locker. Brandon froze. The folder was thick, official-looking, almost too significant to belong to someone in Ellis's position. Something shifted in Brandon at that moment. His mind raced. Why would a janitor have something so important? What was hidden in that small, unassuming locker that no one ever noticed? For the first time, Brandon felt a flicker of doubt about his assumptions, a gnawing awareness that the world was far larger, stranger, and more complex than he had ever imagined. Ellis, unaware of Brandon's scrutiny, continued his work as if nothing had happened. Yet for Brandon, the balance of power had subtly shifted. The arrogant, untouchable teen who had once laughed at the janitor now felt the faintest twinge of curiosity, and with it, the first stirrings of respect, or perhaps even awe. The seeds of change had been planted. And though Brandon didn't realize it yet, the mockery that had defined their interactions was about to give way to a story that would challenge his assumptions, teach him lessons he never anticipated, and reveal the extraordinary hidden behind an ordinary face. Because in Ellis Turner's quiet diligence and behind the door of that mysterious locker lay secrets that would upend Brandon's world, and force him to confront truths about humanity, humility, and the real meaning of worth. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over Seattle, leaving a chill in the air that nipped at the students' faces as they hurried to class. The halls of Ridgewood High hummed with the familiar rhythm of lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, and the muffled chatter of teens. Yet in the midst of this orchestrated chaos, Ellis Turner moved with his usual quiet precision, a ghost-like presence in a world that paid little attention to him. Locker 112 sat tucked away in a seldom-used hallway near the maintenance area, its rusty hinges and peeling paint making it easy to overlook. For years, it had remained anonymous, a simple, functional space for Ellis to store his belongings. But to Brandon, who had begun to notice the janitor more than he cared to admit, it had become something else entirely, a source of intrigue, a puzzle demanding to be solved. It started innocuously enough. Brandon had caught glimpses of the locker as he passed by, an edge of a folder, the corner of a photograph, the faint glimmer of what appeared to be documents stacked neatly inside. His friends thought he was obsessed with teasing Ellis, but Brandon's interest had shifted subtly from mockery to curiosity. Something about that locker gnawed at him, hinting at a life behind Ellis's calm exterior that Brandon could not comprehend. He lingered longer in the halls, pretending to check his own locker while subtly observing Ellis. The janitor's routine fascinated him, the careful way he sorted his cleaning supplies, the deliberate motions he made when opening and closing the locker, the fleeting glance at the contents before tucking the items back with a quiet reverence. Brandon couldn't explain it, but there was weight to Ellis's actions, an intentionality that suggested importance, purpose, and perhaps a past far removed from the polished floors of Ridgewood High. Man, why is he so careful with that locker? Brandon whispered to his friend Cameron one day, keeping his voice low as they leaned against the cafeteria wall. It's like it's a vault or something. Look at how he handles it, like it's gold or top-secret documents were. Dude, it's a janitor's locker, Cameron interrupted, rolling his eyes. You're reading way too much into it. Brandon shrugged, but his gaze remained fixed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant inside. Something that Ellis wasn't showing anyone. His imagination ran wild, perhaps awards, hidden inventions, even secret scholarships for students. The possibilities seemed endless, and each one made the locker more compelling. Over the next few days, Brandon's fascination grew. He started arriving early, lingering in corners near the maintenance area, pretending to be absorbed in homework or conversation while his attention focused entirely on the mysterious locker. He noticed small details, the faint scratch marks on the door, the careful stacking of folders, the way Ellis paused for a brief moment before closing it. Each observation added fuel to Brandon's curiosity, intensifying his sense that there was a hidden life behind the janitor's unassuming demeanor. He began imagining Ellis as someone more than a janitor, someone who had accomplished things far beyond the walls of Ridgewood High, someone who had lived a life of adventure, brilliance, or tragedy that Brandon couldn't even fathom. One rainy afternoon, Brandon's imagination became unbearable. He ducked into the hallway while most students rushed to the cafeteria, pretending to adjust his backpack but inching closer to the locker. Through the slightly open gap between the door and the frame, he caught a glimpse of folders filled with papers, some yellowed with age, and photographs showing a younger Ellis with a young man wearing a graduation cap. His heartbeat quickened. Questions flooded his mind. Who was that young man? Was he Ellis's son? Why were these papers hidden here instead of being displayed or stored somewhere official? And why did Ellis choose to live quietly as a janitor when his life clearly held accomplishments far beyond the reach of Ridgewood High? Brandon felt a mix of awe, guilt, and intrigue, a cocktail of emotions that he had never experienced before. Every passing day, every glance at Locker 112 intensified the suspense, leaving him teetering on the edge of discovery. He wanted to know more, to see the truth for himself, but he also feared the consequences. Ellis, meanwhile, remained oblivious to Brandon's quiet observation. He continued his work with the calm efficiency that had become his signature. Yet, even in his routine, there were hints of the man he had been, the careful handling of documents, the fleeting glances at photos that seemed to hold deep memories, the subtle expressions that flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. It was in these moments, Brandon realized, that the janitor's true story began to reveal itself, not in words, not in boasts or lectures, but in quiet gestures, meticulous care, and the unspoken weight of a life that had seen both triumph and tragedy. The suspense reached its peak one afternoon when Brandon, unable to resist any longer, lingered near the locker long enough to notice a folder labeled with neat, precise handwriting, awards and achievements. The letters were barely visible from the angle he stood, but it was enough. Brandon's curiosity ignited into obsession. He needed to know what was inside. And he had no idea that what awaited him in that unassuming locker would not only challenge his arrogance but also redefine his understanding of success, humility, and true value. Because behind the peeling paint, rusted hinges, and mundane exterior of Locker 112 lay a story of resilience, brilliance, and profound loss, a story that Brandon would soon uncover, changing the course of his life forever. By mid-October, Seattle mornings were cloaked in mist, giving Ridgewood High an ethereal, almost cinematic feel. The hallways echoed with the familiar rhythms of lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, and students' chatter, yet Brandon Whitmore's mind was only half on his surroundings. The other half belonged entirely to Locker 112, and more specifically, to the man behind it, Ellis Turner. Over the past few weeks, Brandon had watched the janitor in ways he would never admit to anyone. What began as teasing and idle curiosity had evolved into something far more consuming. Every glance at Ellis, every flicker of movement near that unassuming locker, fueled a quiet obsession. Brandon found himself imagining what could be hidden inside: awards, certificates, perhaps inventions or blueprints, even photographs or documents hinting at a life far removed from the mop and bucket he had dismissed for so long. It began innocently enough. Brandon lingered near the maintenance area during breaks, pretending to check his locker while observing Ellis at work. He made small notes in his mind, the careful stacking of cleaning rags, the meticulous organization of supplies, the folder he glimpsed that seemed almost out of place for a janitor. Each detail added weight to the mystery, intensifying his fascination. But soon, casual observation wasn't enough. Brandon found himself thinking about the locker during class, during meals, even at night as he lay in his bed in his father's Seattle penthouse. He imagined opening it, rifling through the contents, discovering secrets that could change everything he thought he knew about the quiet man who had become an unwitting puzzle in his life. His friends noticed the change. "You've been spacing out a lot lately," Cameron said one afternoon during lunch. "Something going on?" Brandon waved him off, masking the obsession with a joke. "Nah, just thinking about homework. You know, big brain stuff." But the truth was far more complicated. Brandon's mind was caught between arrogance, curiosity, and an unsettling sense of guilt. He had spent months mocking Ellis, laughing at him with his friends, and now he realized there was far more to this man than he had ever considered. The awareness gnawed at him, an uncomfortable sensation he was unaccustomed to. One day, during an unguarded moment, Brandon's curiosity got the better of him. Ellis had stepped away briefly, leaving locker 112 slightly ajar. Brandon's heartbeat quickened. The temptation was undeniable. He edged closer, pretending to adjust his backpack, his eyes darting to the folder that protruded slightly from the locker. "What is in there?" he whispered to himself, a low, hushed murmur that sounded almost conspiratorial. His pulse raced with anticipation and a touch of fear. He knew he shouldn't, yet every instinct drove him toward the truth. Brandon imagined the consequences. What if he discovered something extraordinary? What if this janitor, whom he had mocked without thought, had a history filled with brilliance, achievement, or tragedy? His curiosity transformed into a complex mix of excitement, guilt, and awe, a cocktail of emotions that he had never navigated before. Over the next few days, Brandon's fascination became a quiet obsession. He arrived early to school, claiming to need extra study time, only to linger near the maintenance area. He followed Ellis discreetly during his work, noting each subtle motion, each careful glance at his locker, each folder retrieved and replaced. Brandon's mind raced with theories, inventions, awards, hidden talent, or perhaps a personal tragedy buried behind the janitor's quiet demeanor. Even Brandon's friends began to notice the change in him. He was distracted in class, lost in thought during meals, and increasingly withdrawn from casual social interactions. Cameron finally confronted him one afternoon. "Brandon, Manitoba, what's going on with you?" he asked, leaning against the cafeteria counter. "You're acting different. Obsessed with that janitor or something?" Brandon laughed nervously, masking his feelings with humor. "Obsessed? Me? Nah, just curious, I guess." But deep down, he knew it was more than curiosity. There was a pull he couldn't explain, a fascination that bordered on reverence. Ellis was no ordinary janitor, and Brandon's subconscious mind was beginning to acknowledge it, even if his ego resisted. Brandon's obsession grew to the point where he began researching subtle clues. He noticed the kind of shoes Ellis wore, the neatness of his uniform, the way he handled tasks with patience and precision that suggested a background in discipline or technical work. Brandon even overheard snippets of conversation with staff that hinted at a life filled with unexpected depth and experiences far beyond the walls of Ridgewood High. One rainy afternoon, Brandon's patience nearly broke. The janitor had stepped out for a brief break, leaving the locker slightly ajar again. Brandon's fingers itched to open it, to discover the truth. Yet he hesitated, caught between his curiosity and the understanding that this was someone else's private space, a man he had mocked without knowing the weight of his life. He turned away, conflicted, but the seed had been planted. Brandon realized he couldn't let go. The locker, the janitor, the hidden life, everything demanded to be understood. He would learn the truth, no matter how long it took. This growing obsession marked a turning point. Brandon was no longer the carefree, arrogant teenager who laughed at others without thought. He had glimpsed the extraordinary behind the ordinary, and it had awakened something inside him: respect, curiosity, and the beginnings of a moral awakening. What he didn't know yet was that his pursuit of knowledge would lead him into a story of resilience, brilliance, and heartbreak that would challenge every assumption he had about success, human worth, and the meaning of life itself. Because hidden in locker 112, beneath folders, photographs, and carefully preserved documents, was a life story that would forever alter Brandon's perspective and set him on a path toward understanding humility, empathy, and the extraordinary courage that often hides in plain sight. The air in Ridgewood High was crisp that morning, and a faint drizzle had left the polished hallways glistening, reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Students hurried to their classes, backpacks slung carelessly over shoulders, their conversations a distant murmur to anyone paying attention. Yet in a quiet corridor near the maintenance area, Brandon Whitmore felt a tension that made each step heavier than usual. Today, he had decided, was the day. For weeks, his curiosity had grown into an obsession. Locker 112, with its peeling paint and rusted hinges, had haunted his thoughts during classes, meals, and even late at night in his father's penthouse. The glimpses of folders, photographs, and papers had fueled his imagination: awards, blueprints, or even something extraordinary that justified the quiet authority Ellis carried. And now, with Ellis momentarily away attending to another part of the school, Brandon's pulse quickened. He lingered at the edge of the hallway, glancing to ensure no one else was watching, and slowly approached the locker. His hand hovered over the handle, a mix of excitement, fear, and guilt coursing through him. He knew he shouldn't, yet every instinct drove him toward the truth. With a careful breath, he pulled the door open. The locker revealed a meticulously organized collection of folders, certificates, photographs, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Brandon's eyes widened as he scanned the contents. Each item told a story far removed from the janitor he had dismissed so casually. One folder contained awards for engineering competitions, accolades for innovative projects, and certificates from prestigious universities. Brandon's breath caught. These were not the achievements of someone who spent his life merely cleaning floors. Ellis Turner had been brilliant, accomplished, and recognized in fields Brandon could barely understand. And then there were the photographs. Brandon's heart thumped as he saw images of a young man, smiling, confident, standing in graduation robes. Notes scribbled alongside the photos revealed the young man's name, Daniel Turner. Brandon's fingers trembled as he turned the pages, piecing together a story he had never expected. Daniel was Ellis's son, a prodigy who had excelled academically, loved deeply, and tragically had passed away in a car accident years earlier. The realization hit Brandon like a punch to the chest. He had mocked a man who had endured unimaginable loss, a man who had given up recognition for the quiet dignity of service. The arrogance he had carried so carelessly now felt shallow, meaningless, and cruel. Brandon sank to his knees, staring at the locker's contents in awe and guilt. The man he had ridiculed was not merely a janitor. He was a father who had loved and lost, a brilliant mind who had chosen humility over fame, a person who had endured life's harshest trials with grace. Among the folders, Brandon discovered handwritten journals, letters to his late son, reflections on life, and notes about projects he had once dreamed of pursuing. Each word revealed depth, resilience, and an unwavering strength that Brandon had never encountered. The quiet dignity Ellis carried was not the result of simple patience, it was forged in the fires of profound loss and extraordinary accomplishment. Brandon's emotions swirled. Shock, guilt, awe, and something he had never felt before, a stirring of humility. He realized that his assumptions, built on wealth and social hierarchy, had blinded him to the true measure of a person's worth. All this time, he had laughed at someone whose life was far richer, far deeper, than his own. As he continued to explore the locker, Brandon found letters from former colleagues and awards recognizing Ellis's contributions to significant engineering projects. There were newspaper articles praising his innovations, certificates from community organizations acknowledging his volunteer work, and photographs capturing moments of quiet heroism, helping struggling students, mentoring young people, and dedicating himself to service without seeking recognition. Each piece of evidence dismantled Brandon's arrogance and rebuilt his understanding of value, integrity, and humility. The man he had mocked daily was extraordinary in ways Brandon had never imagined, and the revelation left him trembling, not from fear, but from a profound sense of awe and remorse. Suddenly, a sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Brandon froze. His mind raced. Had he been caught? Would Ellis be angry? Ellis appeared at the end of the corridor, his eyes calm, almost knowing. He had returned from his brief task and had spotted Brandon lingering near the locker. The folder slipped slightly in Brandon's hands, and he instinctively tried to close the locker, but it was too late. Ellis's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "Brandon," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the world around them. "I see you've found my life." Brandon swallowed, guilt and shame washing over him. I didn't mean to," he stammered. Ellis smiled faintly, not with anger, but with understanding. "I know. Curiosity is natural. What matters is what you do with what you've learned." Brandon's mind reeled. He had laughed at this man, mocked him, and now he understood the depth of what he had overlooked. Ellis Turner was not defined by his uniform, his job, or the perceptions of those around him. He was defined by resilience, brilliance, and the courage to continue despite unimaginable loss. The discovery was a turning point, not just in Brandon's perception of Ellis, but in his understanding of himself. It was the first step in a journey that would challenge his arrogance, awaken his empathy, and ultimately transform his life. In that quiet corridor, surrounded by folders, photographs, and evidence of a life well lived, Brandon realized a profound truth: true value is not measured by status or wealth, but by character, resilience, and the way one treats others. The janitor he had once dismissed had become the teacher Brandon never expected, and the story hidden inside Locker 112 would guide him toward humility, respect, and a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be extraordinary. The hallway seemed to shrink around Brandon Whitmore as he stared at Ellis Turner, who now stood calmly at the end of the corridor. The weight of what Brandon had just discovered pressed heavily against his chest. Folders, photographs, awards, each item had dismantled the illusion he had built around the janitor. And now, for the first time, Ellis was speaking directly to him. "I see you've found my life," Ellis repeated softly, the calm in his voice carrying authority rather than anger. Brandon's throat went dry. I didn't know. Brandon stammered, words failing to convey the mix of guilt, awe, and confusion swirling inside him. Ellis raised a hand, gently halting the torrent of excuses. "Brandon, you don't need to apologize for curiosity. What matters is understanding it. And now that you've seen, I suppose it's time I tell you the story behind it. Brandon nodded silently, unable to tear his eyes from the man who had just redefined everything he thought he knew about strength, dignity, and resilience. Ellis began, his voice steady, painting a picture of a life far removed from Ridgewood High's polished halls. I wasn't always a janitor, Brandon. I once worked as an engineer, designing systems that were used in industries I'm not sure you'd even imagine. I loved my work, it challenged me, pushed me, and gave me a sense of purpose. And then there was my son, Daniel. Bright, ambitious, full of life, he was everything to me. My joy, my pride, my reason for dreaming bigger. He made me believe anything was possible. Brandon's breath caught. He remembered the photographs in the locker, the young man in graduation robes. Now Ellis's words gave them meaning. But life has a way of testing you, Ellis continued, his tone steady but tinged with sorrow. Daniel passed away in a car accident, and with him went a part of myself I had never known could break. I could have stayed in the world I knew, chasing accolades, fame, or recognition. But I realized, none of that mattered if I couldn't live with integrity, humility, and purpose. So I chose a quieter path, a path where I could still make a difference, in small ways, for people who might never notice. Brandon felt the walls of arrogance he had built crumble. The man he had mocked, laughed at, and dismissed was someone who had endured tragedy, loss, and still found meaning in life through service to others. Ellis gestured toward the locker. Everything you saw, the awards, the letters, the photographs, they are pieces of a life I've carried with me. They remind me of what was, and what can be. But more importantly, they remind me that dignity, resilience, and kindness are the true markers of success. Brandon swallowed, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I laughed at you, I made fun of you, and now I see. I see what I've been missing. Ellis's gaze softened, and a faint smile appeared. Then perhaps the lesson isn't about me, Brandon. It's about you. It's about learning to see people, to understand them beyond appearances. It's about realizing that every life has depth, and every person has a story worth hearing. For the first time, Brandon truly listened, not just hearing the words, but feeling their weight. He thought of the countless times he had ridiculed Ellis, assumed superiority based on wealth and status, and overlooked the humanity in others. Each memory brought a sting of guilt, but also an awakening, the beginning of understanding, empathy, and humility. Ellis continued, sharing stories from his past. How he had designed a machine that helped provide clean water to remote communities. How he had volunteered secretly, mentoring students who struggled academically or socially. How he had faced his grief after Daniel's death and found meaning in service rather than fame. Each story revealed the depth of Ellis's character and the extraordinary life hidden behind the janitor's uniform. Brandon listened in awe, feeling a mix of admiration, guilt, and inspiration. By the time Ellis finished, the hallway seemed quieter, as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the weight of the revelation. Brandon realized he was no longer the arrogant teen who laughed at a janitor for doing his job. He had glimpsed something far greater, the courage to endure, the wisdom to serve, and the humility to remain unseen despite extraordinary talent. Finally, Brandon spoke, his voice trembling slightly. I want to learn from you. I want to understand how you became, you. I want to do better. Ellis nodded, a gentle affirmation of the transformation beginning within Brandon. Then start by seeing people, Brandon. Start by valuing character over status, effort over appearances, and kindness over arrogance. The rest will follow. In that quiet hallway, amidst lockers and the faint smell of polish and rain, a bridge had formed between two lives, one marked by privilege and arrogance, the other by humility and resilience. Brandon had stepped onto that bridge, not yet fully across, but ready to learn the lessons Ellis had silently embodied for years. The discovery of the locker had been shocking. But the confrontation, the revelation, was transformative. Brandon realized that life's most important lessons often come from those we least expect, and that true greatness is measured not by wealth, talent, or recognition, but by courage, integrity, and the impact one has on others. As he walked away from Locker 112, Brandon felt something shift inside him. The arrogance that had defined him seemed distant, almost foreign. What remained was curiosity tempered with respect, observation tempered with empathy, and the first real understanding of what it meant to be human. Ellis Turner, the man Brandon had once mocked, had taught him the most important lesson of all, to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and the humanity in everyone, no matter their station in life. The rain had stopped, leaving Seattle's streets glistening in the pale afternoon sunlight. Inside Ridgewood High, the usual cacophony of students was underway, lockers slamming, laughter echoing, and the rhythmic footsteps of busy teenagers. Yet for Brandon Whitmore, the world looked different now. The arrogance and careless laughter that had once defined him had been replaced by a quiet awareness, a lingering echo of the lessons Ellis Turner had shared. The encounter in the hallway, the discovery of Locker 112 and Ellis's revelation, had left a profound impression on Brandon. The janitor's life, marked by brilliance, tragedy, and quiet service, had shown him the depth of humanity he had long overlooked. And Brandon realized that understanding was only the first step. Transformation required action. Brandon began with small gestures, almost imperceptible at first. In the classroom, he noticed a freshman struggling to carry a pile of textbooks. Instinctively, he stepped forward, offering help without expectation of recognition. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, but Brandon felt a subtle warmth in response, a small but powerful reminder that change begins with empathy. During lunch, Brandon approached a group of students who were often overlooked. He joined their conversation, not to dominate it, but to listen. He asked questions, genuinely interested in their thoughts, ideas, and experiences. The shift was subtle, but it was noticed. Teachers and students alike began to see a different side of Brandon, a side that reflected curiosity, respect, and an openness that had previously been absent. Yet transformation was not without its challenges. Brandon's friends, accustomed to his previous arrogance and teasing, noticed the change and questioned it. "Dude, what's going on with you?" Cameron asked one afternoon, leaning against a locker. "You're acting weird. Since when do you care about anyone but yourself?" Brandon paused, then smiled softly. "Maybe I'm learning to see people for who they really are, not what I think they should be," he replied. His words were met with skepticism, but Brandon didn't mind. The opinions of others no longer defined him. His actions did. The lessons from Ellis extended beyond simple kindness. They were about humility, respect, and understanding the value of each individual story. Brandon began noticing small acts of humanity that had once escaped him, a teacher comforting a struggling student, a classmate offering a hand to someone who had dropped their books, the quiet patience of the janitors and staff who kept the school functioning. One afternoon, Brandon lingered near locker 112, not out of curiosity, but out of gratitude. Ellis was busy at work, moving with his usual precision and calm. Brandon approached him hesitantly. "Ellis," he began, voice low, "thank you for showing me, for teaching me things I never would have learned on my own." Ellis paused, looking at Brandon with a gentle nod. "You're welcome, Brandon. Just remember, learning is only meaningful if it changes the way you live. Knowledge without action is empty." Brandon felt the weight of those words. He realized that the true lesson was not merely understanding Ellis's past or accomplishments, but applying the values embedded in them: resilience in the face of adversity, humility in everyday actions, and empathy toward others. The transformation became more pronounced in Brandon's interactions. During gym class, he encouraged a struggling teammate instead of mocking him. In group projects, he listened more than he spoke, valuing contributions over status. Slowly, students began to respond differently to him. Where once he had commanded attention through arrogance, he now inspired respect through empathy and authenticity. Yet the most profound change occurred within Brandon himself. He began reflecting on his own life, wealth, and privilege, not with entitlement, but with a sense of responsibility. He recognized that his resources could be used for good, that influence was meaningful when paired with integrity, and that true character was demonstrated in how one treated those often overlooked by society. One evening, as he sat in his father's study overlooking the Seattle skyline, Brandon thought of Ellis and the locker that had sparked his transformation. He realized that the janitor's story was not just about brilliance or loss, it was about resilience, service, and the quiet courage to live with purpose. And Brandon vowed that he would carry these lessons forward in his actions, decisions, and relationships. Over the next few weeks, Brandon's transformation rippled through Ridgewood High. Students noticed a change in him, teachers acknowledged his maturity, and even his friends began to adapt, learning from his example. Brandon had become a catalyst for small acts of kindness, empathy, and understanding, proof that one person's transformation can influence an entire community. Yet, the story was not over. The lessons of Ellis and Locker 112 would continue to unfold, guiding Brandon toward a deeper understanding of life's complexities, the power of humility, and the importance of using one's resources and privilege to lift others rather than elevate oneself. By embracing action over arrogance, empathy over entitlement, and integrity over appearances, Brandon had begun a journey that would reshape not only his own life but also the lives of those around him. The shock of discovery had evolved into meaningful transformation, and Brandon was ready to carry forward the lessons learned from the janitor nobody had once noticed. Autumn had deepened into a crisp, gray November in Seattle, and Ridgewood High buzzed with its usual energy. Yet beneath the casual chatter of students and the rhythmic squeak of sneakers against polished floors, Brandon Whitmore felt a growing tension. Transformation, he was beginning to realize, was never simple or linear. It demanded more than reflection, it demanded courage, integrity, and the willingness to act when confronted by unexpected challenges. Brandon's journey since discovering Ellis Turner's hidden past had been profound. He had moved from arrogance to humility, from mockery to empathy. But the real test of character, he soon discovered, was not in quiet observations or small gestures, it was in moments when his new principles collided with the expectations, assumptions, and pressures of the world around him. The first test came in the form of peer skepticism. Brandon's friends, Cameron and a few others, had grown accustomed to his previous persona, confident, teasing, and untouchable. Now, seeing him show patience, empathy, and kindness to others, they reacted with subtle ridicule. "You're acting like a charity case, man," Cameron joked one afternoon during lunch, the words laced with mockery. "What happened to the Brandon we know?" Brandon felt a flicker of old frustration, the instinct to snap back or laugh. But he paused, recalling Ellis's words, "Knowledge without action is empty." Instead of reacting with sarcasm or anger, he smiled gently. "I'm just trying to see things differently," he said quietly. "You'd be surprised what you might learn if you tried it." The subtle defiance in his tone surprised his friends. It was not arrogance, it was integrity, quiet and firm, a reflection of the lessons he had absorbed. Their laughter faded, replaced by a hesitant awareness that Brandon had changed. The next test arrived in a more direct form. During a school assembly, Brandon noticed a younger student, Marcus, being humiliated by one of the more popular seniors for failing to answer a question correctly. The crowd's laughter mirrored the echoes of the ridicule Brandon himself had once directed at Ellis. The temptation to remain silent, to watch and avoid confrontation, was strong. Yet he knew the lesson of empathy could not be abandoned now. Brandon stepped forward, positioning himself near Marcus and the bully. "Hey," he said firmly, his voice steady but calm. "It's okay to get it wrong. We all make mistakes. You're learning, and that's what matters." The hall fell silent. Brandon's intervention drew the attention of teachers and students alike. The bully, momentarily thrown off, muttered under his breath and walked away. Marcus looked at Brandon with wide eyes, gratitude mingled with awe. For Brandon, the moment was transformative. It wasn't just about helping Marcus, it was a reflection of his own growth, the courage to act when he had once remained passive, the ability to confront injustice with empathy rather than arrogance. Yet challenges continued to test him in subtler ways. Students whispered, speculated, and occasionally mocked his new persona, questioning his motives and sincerity. Brandon had to navigate these social pressures without losing sight of the lessons Ellis had taught him. Each encounter was a small trial, a choice to act with integrity despite external judgments. At home, Brandon's growth was tested further. His father, a powerful businessman with high expectations, noticed the change. "You've been different lately," he remarked one evening. "More thoughtful. Less showy. What's going on?" Brandon hesitated, realizing that transformation was not just about actions at school, it extended to his life outside it, to family and responsibilities. "I've been learning from someone," he said slowly, not wanting to reveal too much, yet feeling compelled to acknowledge the impact of Ellis's lessons. His father's expression was unreadable. "Good," he said finally, leaving Brandon with a mix of relief and unease. Approval, he realized, was not the goal of true change. The real test was living according to the principles he now valued, regardless of recognition or reward. As the weeks passed, Brandon faced additional trials. A student attempting to manipulate him socially to regain his old status. Teachers testing his accountability during group projects. Witnessing acts of unkindness or bullying, forcing him to choose between silence and intervention. Each test reinforced the lessons Ellis had imparted: humility, empathy, courage, and integrity. Brandon began to understand that transformation was an ongoing process, not a single moment of revelation. True growth required vigilance, self-awareness, and the willingness to act even when inconvenient or uncomfortable. Perhaps the most poignant trial occurred when Brandon discovered an opportunity to make a tangible impact. The school was organizing a fundraiser for a local community shelter, and many students were dismissive, seeing it as tedious or insignificant. Brandon, remembering Ellis's quiet acts of service, stepped up. He coordinated a team, organized volunteers, and inspired his peers to contribute. The result was transformative, not only for the shelter, which received significant support, but for Brandon himself. He realized that leadership was not about commanding attention or asserting dominance, it was about serving, uplifting, and making meaningful change. By the end of Chapter 9, Brandon's journey through tests and trials had cemented the transformation begun in the corridor by Locker 112. He was no longer defined by arrogance, privilege, or shallow status. He was becoming someone capable of empathy, courage, and action, guided by the extraordinary lessons learned from a man society had once overlooked. The stage was now set for the final chapter, a culmination where Brandon's transformation, choices, and the lessons from Ellis would converge, leading to resolution, reflection, and profound emotional impact. Winter's first snow had begun to dust Seattle's streets, transforming Ridgewood High into a quiet wonderland of white and gray. The air was crisp, carrying with it a sense of closure, reflection, and new beginnings. Brandon Whitmore walked through the halls with a calmness that had never been his before. The laughter, teasing, and social hierarchies that once dominated his world seemed distant now, replaced by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. The journey from arrogance to empathy, from mockery to respect, had been long, marked by discovery, confrontation, and trials. The catalyst had been Ellis Turner, the janitor with a hidden past, a quiet brilliance, and a heart shaped by resilience and loss. Brandon had stared into the contents of Locker 112, faced the truth of Ellis's life, and learned lessons that would stay with him forever. In the weeks following the confrontation, Brandon's transformation had been tested repeatedly. He had intervened in bullying, shown kindness to students who were overlooked, and taken responsibility for his own actions. He had applied the lessons not only at school but at home, navigating family expectations with humility and integrity. Each choice, each small act of empathy, strengthened his understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. One afternoon, Brandon found himself once again near Locker 112. Ellis was organizing supplies, moving with his usual calm efficiency. Brandon paused, watching the man he had once mocked. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and admiration. "Ellis," he said softly, stepping closer, "I just wanted to thank you again. For everything. For showing me what really matters, and for letting me see the truth." Ellis looked at him, eyes calm, and nodded. "The truth is always there, Brandon. You just need to have the courage to see it, and the humility to act upon it." Brandon smiled, a quiet, sincere expression that reflected the growth within him. He realized that the lessons he had learned were not limited to Ellis's story, they were universal. They applied to every interaction, every decision, and every choice about how to treat others. As the final weeks of the semester unfolded, Brandon continued to embody the transformation. He mentored younger students, volunteered for community projects, and encouraged peers to act with integrity. His efforts did not go unnoticed. Teachers, students, and staff alike began to recognize a new presence in Brandon, someone who led by example, not by privilege, popularity, or intimidation. But it was not only his peers who noticed. Brandon's father observed the change, noting how his son carried himself with quiet confidence, humility, and empathy. It was a transformation that could not be measured in grades, accolades, or social standing. It was measured in character, and in the ripples of positive influence he created. The climax of Brandon's journey came during a school assembly where students were recognized for their contributions to the community. Brandon was invited to speak, not as a token of privilege, but as someone whose actions had made a meaningful impact. Standing before his peers, he reflected on his journey, the arrogance of youth, the lessons learned from observing others, and the transformative power of empathy and humility. He did not mention wealth, status, or privilege. Instead, he spoke about courage, resilience, and kindness, drawing upon the lessons learned from Ellis Turner and the extraordinary story hidden in a simple janitor's locker. True greatness, Brandon said, voice steady but filled with emotion, is not measured by what you have or what others see. It is measured by how you treat people, by the courage to do the right thing, and by the humility to understand that everyone has a story worth hearing. The applause that followed was genuine, not for his words alone, but for the transformation reflected in his actions. Brandon realized that the true reward of his journey was not recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of living according to principles he now cherished deeply. After the assembly, Brandon approached Ellis, who had been quietly observing. "I've learned more than I could ever explain," Brandon said. "And I hope I can continue to live in a way that honors everything you've taught me." Ellis smiled faintly, placing a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "You already are, Brandon. Now, go live your story, one that will inspire others the way you've been inspired." As the snow fell outside, Brandon felt a profound sense of closure. The journey had begun with curiosity, matured through discovery, and solidified through trials. He had faced arrogance, guilt, fear, and uncertainty, and had emerged with a deeper understanding of life, human worth, and personal responsibility. Locker 112 remained as it had always been, a quiet testament to a life lived with integrity, resilience, and quiet brilliance. But for Brandon, it had become more than a locker. It was a symbol of transformation, of the extraordinary lessons that can come from ordinary places, and of the power of empathy to change not only one person's life, but the lives of countless others. In the weeks and months that followed, Brandon continued to act with humility and purpose. His peers noticed the consistency in his actions, and many began to emulate the kindness and courage he displayed. He had learned that true influence does not come from status, wealth, or appearances. It comes from character, resilience, and the willingness to live with empathy. And so, Brandon Whitmore's story, once defined by arrogance and superficiality, had been reshaped into a narrative of growth, understanding, and enduring impact. The lessons of Ellis Turner, the mysteries of Locker 112, and the trials that tested his character had converged to leave him transformed. In the end, the greatest legacy was not in awards, recognition, or praise. It was in the quiet power of humility, the courage to act with empathy, and the profound understanding that every person, no matter their station, has a story worth hearing and a life worth respecting. Brandon had learned, truly and deeply, that greatness lies not in wealth, status, or appearances, but in the way we live, the choices we make, and the humanity we extend to others.